This game by Mikhail Tal is one of his most remarkable achievements in the end of his career. It was played against Johan Hjartarson in 1987, and Tal was playing with the white pieces, and the opening was the Chigorin defense of the Spanish opening. So after the pretty common moves e4, e5, we end up in this this position, which is pretty much the main line of the Spanish opening. In this position, knight a5 is still by far the main line. And this is sort of the starting position of the Chigorin variation. Black here has a few options. He can go knight to c6 immediately. He can exchange on d4, or he can play bishop d7 like he played in the game, and later maybe do one of those things, play knight to c6 or exchange on d4. Bishop d7. White begins the maneuver of the knight. The knight can come to e3, g3 or h2. This is very common for the Spanish opening. And especially this becomes useful because after black puts the pressure on the bishop on c2, white can hop to e3 with the knight and actually usefully protect the bishop while also, developing the knight to a better square. One of black's major problems in the Spanish opening and the Chigorin system is this knight on a5. And so during the next few moves, black is trying to kind of find a suitable job for this knight, and this is still a challenge. So he tried to play knight to c6, which is, I think, the main line. Attacking d4, hopefully at some point maybe exchanging on d4, maybe not immediately, but while it can be a concession, it can also tactically work for black sometimes. So for the meantime, white shuts things down in the center by playing d5, which creates this pawn structure, which has ups and downs for both sides. I guess this creates a really good outpost for the knight on c6 if the white knight can ever get there. It also, takes away some useful squares from the black pieces like e6. It also sort of shapes the game for the next 20 or so moves, because the pawn chains have been fixed in the center, and now black will try to attack the base of the pawn chain, and white will try to utilize his space advantage in the meantime, and that's what the struggle mostly revolves around. Black goes knight to b4, all because the knight is attacked, and after the bishop moves away, now white threatens to trap this knight with pawn to a3, so black has to free up a square for this knight, so he goes a5, and after knight a6 comes the first sort of critical moment of the game, which isn't really critical because we're still in the book, it's still theory. But the very important thing is for white to play pawn to b4, taking away the c5 square from the knight. And it's clear that in the game black played g6, and the idea of g6 is to prepare a 5. A 5 immediately is not possible, so black has to sort of think ahead. His plan is to move the knight while watching out for knight to e5 check, discovered attack. So he protects the knight in advance, and that's the purpose of the move g6. Now, the obvious question is, could he instead just take on b4? And the answer is no, at least not twice. He can still take on b4 once, but then he cannot take on b4 the second time, because then after bishop d2 and queen to c5, this knight would get trapped, so that wouldn't work. There's no escape squares for this knight. So going back, so that kind of explains why black played g6. It's basically the beginning of his play on the king side. White reinforces b4, black exchanges. Now the knight on a6 is hanging, so he has to go queen to a6. And now there are two pawn islands sort of on for each side on the b file, and there's two kind of aspects of this. Well, one is these pawns, they create outposts. So black wants to bring his knight to one of those outposts, but also white would love to put the knight on a5, and we'll see how he goes about this. But the purpose of the next move, though, bishop d3, is to put pressure on the pawn on b5, so that as white knight goes around his route to put pressure on b5, the pressure on b5 arrives before black has a chance to play knight a6 to c7 to a8, because once he gets to b6, the b pawn will be hanging. So this was very important timing. Black still plays knight to c7, because on a6 he doesn't have a future anyway, and now white plays knight to c2. Black now wants to... His play on the queen side doesn't come on time. He doesn't have time to bring the knight to c4, so he has to go ahead and try to create some plans on some play against the white center. So he wants to go knight to h5, f5, and then the knight on c7 will actually be placed reasonably useful because it will still be undermining d5. So that's black's plan for the next few moves. The downside of that is, well, white gets a bit of a free hand on the queen side for the next few moves, and also when black plays f5, his king would get a bit exposed, and that's what sort of brought black down in this game. For now, he played knight to h5, bishop e3, threatening rook a7, so black has to oppose on the queen side. Now white plays a useful move, queen to d2. Well, this connects the rooks, and it also threatens to play pawn to g4, shutting down f5, and then it's important that the f4 square would be controlled enough times, and the black knight wouldn't be able to hop to f4. So black has to play 5 immediately. That's why he exchanged first, and then which I should say actually helps white to bring his knight to c5 to a5. But black had to play 5 immediately, so he plays this. Now there's sort of an unpleasant threat of pawn to f4 trapping the bishop, so that the bishop moves, and here comes what Tal thought was a concession for black, but at the same time he didn't have much choice. The problem is that if the rook moves, say it goes here, then white can try to generate some play by exchanging on e5, on f5, and then just sort of destroying black center. And then the tactical idea is that after this, white regains the piece on h5, because the knight can't go to g7. So because of this, black did not want to move the rook, so he instead went knight to g7. But the knight on g7 is kind of badly placed. On h5 he really wanted to go back to f6 to put pressure on these pawns, but now that is no longer possible, and he has to kind of play a passive role on g7 a little bit. That's the first concession. Now this also allows white to carry on with the transfer of the knight to c6, and now here it also turns out that the tension on the queen side and in the center is to a large extent in white's favor. He can capture on e5 on f5 at any point, and also black doesn't really have much of a leeway in capturing on e4. That would give white too many good squares for his pieces. Like e4 is a really good square for the white pieces, and knight or bishop could be placed there quite well. So he decided to shut down the play on the queen side, on the king side. But now white's play on the queen side comes in, knight a5, and now white sort of builds up against the c6 square, rook a8. Now attacking c7, so knight moves, and now with queen to b3, white starts to set up threats against the black pawn chain. Now knight e5 is threatened, so black defended. The knight now comes to c6, knight h5, queen to b2. Now that well, that just builds up the pressure against the e5 pawn, and at this point black sort of made an important error. He decided to exchange the bishops, and the way he did that, bishop to g7 and then king to g7, just allowed white a spectacular sacrifice. What black had calculated was that the immediate sacrifices on e5 with either knight don't quite work, but he underestimated that white can also use the rook, surprisingly, for undermining this pawn chain that black has in the center, and that he also has some other weaknesses in this position. So white played a completely shocking move, rook to c5, that exploits that b5 is difficult to defend, and also that taking on c5 would just completely eliminate the base of the e5 pawn, and white's attack with two knights and the queen against this king would become very, very dangerous. So he couldn't take on c5. Instead he tried to create counterattack on the a file, but it came a little bit too late. We'll see that white's attack just comes one move ahead of black's attack, and this was probably really difficult to calculate. This was probably more the matter of intuition. So he played queen to a6. Now threatens to exchange queens with rook to a1. So just on time, white takes on b5, and then when the rook is attacked, he goes to b8. That gives up that bishop on d3 that also had to be calculated, right? But Tal understood well that it actually works out to his advantage. So after capture, he now delivers the sacrifice of the knight on e5, and now the black king is even more exposed because there's this white rook still on the 8th rank, and everything comes with a tempo because this is attacked, right? So he had to move the queen to d1, king escapes, and now black's sort of last chance for counterplay was rook to a1, and this threatens mate on h1, but unfortunately for black, Tal's mate just comes one move ahead. So so he went knight to g4, check, discover check. Very important that well, basically the black king is gonna have 3 squares for escape against the checks that white can give him, and it's important that all those squares are covered with the queen and the 2 knights. So first comes knight g4, only move is king to f7, and now another very important move that with tempo takes away the e7 square from the black king. So after king e7, he also gives knight g8 check, and now when they and here black resigned. This is a nice culmination for this game because the black king gets checkmated basically by the 2 knights. So after king to f7, knight g5 would be checkmate. Like, quite a brilliant attack by Mikhail Tal, who was in his he's probably about 50 years old at that point, and his health was declining, but he still had this brilliance that could, you know, spark in certain games, and this definitely shows that also he nicely combined the positional play and exploited the tactical position, the tactical opportunities in the position. Quite a remarkable game all in all.